So before we begin, I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction. I'll be moderating the next round of sessions. So the first presentation that we'll have is by Anne-Marie Lyons and myself. It's going to focus on navigating your ArchivesSpace implementation. Anne-Marie, if you want to start sharing the slides now, that's great. And we'll get started in just a second. So after our presentation, there's going to be a series of lightning round presentations. They'll be about 10 minutes long. I'll be introducing each of the presenters. They'll share their screens and they'll have up to 10 minutes to talk about their experience. All I ask is that you hold your questions until the end of the lightning round presentations, and then I'll follow up in the chat box. I'll be reading the questions, for those who are listening, on their phone, or who are watching the recording, so they can follow along. All right. So Anne-Marie, take it away.
Okay, great. Can you see my screen okay, Madeline?
I sure can.
Okay, great. All right, well, welcome everyone. This is our first presentation. It's called We're on the Road to Somewhere, Navigating Our ArchivesSpace Implementation. The title was inspired by the Talking Heads song, We're on the Road to Nowhere, which is sometimes how an ArchivesSpace implementation can feel. So we thought we'd put a positive spin on it. We're gonna get somewhere with this implementation. So here are photos of myself and Madeline. Just a couple of things to know about what we're going to talk about in this presentation. We're kind of assuming that you have already made the choice to use ArchivesSpace and you have it installed. We're going to be talking about getting started with that implementation, creating a project plan, different tools that you can use if you're going to be working with legacy data, resources for training and learning about how to use ArchivesSpace, and community resources. As Christine mentioned before, ArchivesSpace is community supported. We're discussing these topics sort of in a linear order, but in reality are probably going to be doing things at the same time because certain areas are going to inform other areas. So the first stop on our ArchivesSpace implementation roadmap is to identify your hopes and dreams for using ArchivesSpace. And one of the ways that you can do that is to brainstorm on certain questions. So first question, why did you decide to select ArchivesSpace? Second question, what features do you like about ArchivesSpace? What do you think are going to bring value to the way you do things? Now, if your answer to that first question was, well, I didn't really select it, someone told me I had to use it, or our current system is no longer going to be supported, and if you feel like you don't know ArchivesSpace well enough to identify features that might be useful, I recommend you check out the sandbox, and I'll show you a screenshot of it on the next slide. It's a great tool to go and take a look at ArchivesSpace, practice putting one of your finding aids in there, see what that experience is like, see how it appears to researchers on the public user interface, and get an idea of the benefits of what ArchivesSpace can bring you. Something else to think about is if you're going to be importing legacy data, and if so, do you have an opportunity to clean up data before you get it into ArchivesSpace? Or are you going to be starting from scratch, which might give you an opportunity, as Christine mentioned before, to maybe narrow down what standards you're going to be using, what your best practices are going to be for description. Also, do you anticipate anything new happening? We often hear from repositories that when they get ArchivesSpace, they decide to also include accession records, where in the past they had done those separately, like in Microsoft Excel or Access or on paper. So ArchivesSpace gives them an opportunity to put everything in one place. Another opportunity might be if you have digital objects in other areas, in Content DM, on Flickr, somewhere else, you can use ArchivesSpace records to link out, create access points to those digital objects. You might also be able to incorporate new staff workflows or processes. Again, if you're starting from scratch, you can make some different decisions about how you're going to be doing things. This is a screenshot of the sandbox I mentioned, and this gives you access to the staff interface side using a system administrator account, so you can see everything that's in there, and also the public side as well. Another great use of this tool is if you're already using ArchivesSpace and you want to take a look at new versions. This is a great place to come and see what's going to be in that new version, and then you can decide when you're going to update. So once you've done your brainstorming on your hopes and your dreams for ArchivesSpace, the next thing you want to do is get them into very specific goal statements. And those goal statements should be meeting these questions here. What new or improved services are you going to be offering to researchers and also to your staff? They're another substantial audience that ArchivesSpace is going to be meeting the needs of. So these are some examples of goal statements. First one, a one-stop shop archival management system where you have everything, accession records, resource records, digital objects, agents, etc. Second one is provide a front-end interface for patrons to go and do their own searches and find what they're looking for without asking staff for help. And decrease staff time spent on repetitive reference questions. So your goal statements should have some sort of measurability to them, whether it's something that you can see a great improvement in, or something you could send out surveys to your researchers to see how they respond. So when you're doing your goal statements, think about what you can measure down the road to figure out whether or not you've met them. So once you've got those goal statements, your next step is to think about what content are you going to put into ArchivesSpace to meet those goals. So if your goal is to decrease staff time spent on answering repetitive questions, then you're going to want to look to get in descriptions of resources that are requested most often or that your institution is known for. If your goal is to just increase usage of your archives, this is an opportunity to describe hidden collections or make those links to digital objects. If you have a goal to just get content into ArchivesSpace to satisfy some stakeholders, start with what's easiest to get into ArchivesSpace. What do you already have in electronic format? Maybe a donor gave you funding to do some description work. Once you've made decisions about your content, you're going to think about the types of records you're going to use in ArchivesSpace. And some of those records might require you to make some pit stops along the way of your implementation roadmap. Some of those pit stops might be really short, some might be longer. These will just give you some ideas. If you're going to be using ArchivesSpace for subject records, which most people do, definitely take time to learn the LCNAV plugin. The plugin comes enabled in ArchivesSpace. It's a way of importing name headings, name authorities and subject headings into ArchivesSpace. Takes maybe 5 to 10 minutes to learn, and it's a great tool. Top container and location management has some great functionality. If you want to be able to take full advantage of it, you'll have to think about getting your boxes barcoded, or maybe getting faux barcodes on your boxes. There was a message from George Washington University this morning on one of the listservs where they came up with a script to get some faux barcodes in there. So something to think about if you want to take that advantage of that full functionality. ArchivesSpace does math in the space calculator. It can figure out where there is free space in your repository if you get acquisitions or accruals. But in order to do that, it helps to have that repository mapped out in location records ahead of time. Event records are also simple to learn, but you might want to be consistent about them. They allow you to keep track of things that are happening to your materials or to the records about the materials. So you might want to make sure that staff make the same event records for the same types of records. So next up is creating a project plan. So once you've got your goal statements, once you've decided on the content that you're going to be putting into ArchivesSpace and to which records, you want to write up a plan that's going to explain exactly how you're going to do that. And we want to take into account the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So for where, we'll just assume that that's our workspace. For who, you're going to want to identify who's going to be helping you. That could be within your department. That could be outside of your department. If there's IT people you have to get involved. If you're working with a third party for server hosting. If you're a lone arranger, who can you call upon for some help? What are you going to need to get this implementation done? What kind of tools? If you're doing legacy data, are you going to need some custom scripts? Where are your knowledge gaps that you're going to have to fill? When are you going to get this done? Think in terms of if you have due dates. Do you have a planned go live date for your public user interface? Is there a time where you have to have your legacy data put in? You want to identify your work schedule within this project plan. How are you going to do this? What are going to be your step-by-step processes? What are going to be your workflows? Also, how are you going to prioritize it? What are you going to start with? What is going to be your criteria for prioritizing? And why are you doing each step in this project plan? Which specific goal statement is it satisfying? This is an example of an assessment questionnaire that Atlas Systems uses with repositories that use our implementation services. So we look at things like what the data expectations are going to be, what kinds of materials are described, what the plans are for implementation on the repositories and how many people are going to be involved in it, what's the timeline, are there plans to use the public interface? If so, when does that need to go live? So another thing to think about in terms of project plans are how much of a project plan do you need? Do you have a couple of people on staff who are going to be able to help you? Do you have a lot of people on staff who are going to be helping you? Do you have people divided into working groups and teams? And are you going to be doing phases of adoption? If so, you're going to want something that's pretty formal so that everyone understands the plan from beginning to end. Another thing to think about, even if you don't have the human resources, if you do have milestones and due dates, a project plan will keep you on track with that as well. So no matter whether you need a really formal project plan or a really informal project plan, we highly recommend that you create one regardless. And you should start by writing your goal statements at the top. You can do a project plan per goal statement, if that makes sense. And then your priorities that you identified will be listed under that goal statement and how you're going to meet those goal statements. Again, don't forget about the who and what their roles are going to be within your project plan. If you're a lone arranger, definitely look towards, besides the ArchivesSpace community, look toward your professional chapters, particularly local ones, where you might have an opportunity to meet other users face-to-face. And sorry, I think I saw a question show up. Madeline, just let me know if there's any questions. Also, if you can go on site and visit with someone who's using ArchivesSpace, that would be a great tool as well. Something else for everyone is to look at other repositories that are like yours that use ArchivesSpace. Reach out to them, see how they're doing things. If they're using the public user interface, see what decisions they made, what are they presenting to their researchers. The other thing is, don't forget about your work schedule. Make time to do this, and I recommend putting standing meetings on your calendar weekly if possible, whether you're a lone arranger or you have other people helping you. So something like every Friday from 10 to 11:30, we're going to be working on ArchivesSpace. So why are we urging you to do project plans? Keeps you organized, keeps you moving. Most likely you'll have to put ArchivesSpace aside to take care of other things. So when you go back to it, you'll see exactly where you left off. It's going to make your work visible. This is work, and you can show how you've been spending your time. You also never know what could turn into a journal article or a new implementation process that you can share with others. And the end product of your project plan, besides your ArchivesSpace implementation completion, should also be documentation of your decisions. Also, a user's manual will be very helpful as well. And this link to the collection management tools section is an example of people who have shared their users' manuals and their decision-making manuals with the rest of us. This is an example of a project plan for a repository whose main goal was to cut down on staff time spent answering repetitive reference questions. So they started with inputting something, a resource that is requested very often and is not publicly available. And then they moved on to finding aids that they already had in an EAD format that they could import into ArchivesSpace. There's also tools that can help you track a project plan. This example on the screen is Asana, and you can organize this any way that you like. Each one of those white task cards contain separate tasks in a list, and you can assign them to people, and you can assign due dates, and that's one of the ways that you can track your project plan. And an example of a tool, which is a nice segue into what Madeline's going to talk about next.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. And there was a question in the chat, and I will get to that at the very end of the lightning round presentations. So thank you. Okie doke, let me just get situated here. So sorry about that. Okay, so I'm gonna, oh, and I should probably turn on my camera. Sorry about that. All right, so I'm going to talk about the tools for, importing, your legacy data. So on the next slide, before you begin, okay, importing your information, it's important that you ask yourself the following questions. Okay, so number one, what kinds of formats does your legacy system export? So for example, XML, CSV, or other. Number two, is your data normalized or messy? Okay, so for example, are your dates described consistently? Number three, if you do have messy data, do you want to clean up the data first, or do you want to wait until everything is migrated into ArchivesSpace? All right, number four, do you have any backup copies of your legacy data? If you don't, I would highly encourage you to do so. And number five, think about the migration. It's important to create a migration plan, and use the steps that we outlined at the beginning of the presentation to help guide you. So for example, create a plan, set your goal, set your timelines, all your to-dos and so forth. All right, so next up is community supported tools. Now, all of these tools are developed, sustained, and updated by the ArchivesSpace program. So the first one on the list is Archon, or I'm sorry, it's for the Archon or Archivist Toolkit users. There are a list of tools, instructions, and mapping documents that are on the ArchivesSpace website. I've included a link in the slide, and our slides are being shared, so you can follow along. I also included an example, a migration example from Yale University. I also included the link there. If you have some legacy data, in CSV files, or as EAD XML or Mark XML, there are import maps also located on the ArchivesSpace website, and the link is provided in there for you. All right, so the next slide, third-party tools. All right, so all of these tools are developed by members of the ArchivesSpace community, okay, or other open source contributions. I think a very popular one is a Harvard University ASpace import Excel plugin, and that helps support the bulk uploading of resources and archival objects into ArchivesSpace with an Excel spreadsheet. And there's also Steady. It's an open source Ruby on Rails application that was developed by Jason Ronaldo, and they were part of the NCSU libraries. I've included a link in there as well, but this tool will allow users to convert CSV files into EAD for import. Okay, so next up is starting from scratch, and this is, if you don't have any legacy systems, so you're going to use the, use the tools that, are native, and the ArchivesSpace software. So one of the first things that you can look at is the rapid data entry. So that supports the repeated entry of resource components. Okay, so think of those, like, as the series or sub-series, item level information in your resource record. And you can use RDE to populate multiple components of the same level. Okay, so, and there is also a visual aid that is located in the ArchivesSpace Help Center. So if you are a member, and you have access to the ArchivesSpace Help Center, I encourage you to look at that. And then finally, you can set default values fields for repetitive data that is used frequently, across the same records. So, for example, a repository identifier, can be set as a default value for an accession record, or a resource record identifier, and it'll populate that identifier field, in those records, so you don't have to. All right, and then on the next slide, additional migration resources. You can, you can use the application programming interface or the API, and it requires an authenticated user to interact with the ArchivesSpace backend for data cleanup projects. I included some links from the Bentley Historical Library and also Duke University. They have some blogs. They documented their steps, and I think they're very useful. Or, if you have some funding, you can hire an independent consultant to work with you. I've, included a link. It's from the ArchivesSpace homepage for consultants. All right, so next up is training resources. All right, so before you consider training, you should consider the following. How many people will be using ArchivesSpace? Okay, so this includes, any staff, any students, volunteers, and so forth. And then how are your training, or I'm sorry, what are your training or learning preferences? Okay, so do you like self-guided learning, online training, in-person instruction, and so forth? Okay, and so you should also consider who will train the new staff. Okay, so who's going to be responsible for doing that? And finally, number 4, who will maintain the training documentation, and those workflows. So, if that person leaves, do you have a backup? All right, so training resources, if you're an ArchivesSpace member, then you have access to the ArchivesSpace Help Center. Okay, so this is just an example, of the ArchivesSpace Help Center. It includes a user manual, a glossary, and some videos to help you learn the software. And then some additional resources are the Society of American Archivists Collection Management Tools section. Okay, so there's a bunch of documents there that have been placed by other organizations. I've included a link so you can follow along. You can host an ArchivesSpace workshop if it's in your budget, okay? And then you can invite, other institutions along so y'all can learn together. And then finally, if it's in your budget, you can hire an independent consultant or trainer. And those resources are also located on the ArchivesSpace home website, and I've included the link there as well. Thank you.
All right, next we're going to talk about some community resources that might be helpful to you with your implementation. The first one we have here is called the Awesome ArchivesSpace List. It's a great resource that has linked resources that were contributed by other ArchivesSpace users, and specifically on these topics that we see in the table of contents. So what you might find most helpful oops, ooh, it opened up. We'll go ahead and, sorry about that, is a section on implementation and also a section on migrations. And as I mentioned before, one of the end products of your project plan is to have some documentation of decision making. And if you come up with a really good implementation process, please do contribute it to this list. It could be just something like a blog post, and share it with others to help them navigate their implementation. Another resource that you might find helpful is the JIRA page. This is an online issue and project tracking system, and specifically for ArchivesSpace, it's used to collect bug reports and new product requests. And these are links that explain how to submit those items. When you go to the website, you can browse using the tag list here, or you can search using the magnifying glass on the left. This is an example of a bug report. So in the type field, we can see this is a bug. We can see what its status is. People can upload screenshots. They can leave comments if they're seeing this bug as well. You can also vote on the bug or watch the bug. This is an example of a new feature request, and same types of things. We can add comments. Yes, I want this request too, or could you add this little piece to it? Upload screenshots, also vote and watch. And what's nice is that if you choose to follow these bugs and product requests that interest you, you will get email updates every time something happens with that item.
Okay, thank you. All right, so next up is community resources, public user interface, or PUI. So we didn't go into a lot of detail about the PUI, but there are a couple of resources available. If you're starting to think about making the the PUI available. And the first one we have here, is a pre-launch checklist by Mark Custer. And then we have, a second resource from Rachel Trent, at George Washington University, implementing the PUI. Okay, and then I included links to these resources, but the second link is will lead you. Sorry, thank you so much. The second link will lead you to the ArchivesSpace Forum, archive. Next, thank you. Okay, so this next page, is talking about ArchivesSpace technical support. Okay, so if you are an ArchivesSpace member, and you're hosting locally, there are resources available to you. Okay, so first and foremost, don't forget to post your question to the user group listserv. Okay, so that's what I just mentioned there. Secondly, if they, if they can assist you, and you're not getting any help, then feel free to contact the ArchivesSpace home at ArchivesSpaceHome@lyrasis.org. And they will try to assist you. If they can't, then they will send the ticket to the LYRASIS technology services staff, and then they will try to get in and assist you. Thank you. Okay, so next up, okay, so don't forget about the ArchivesSpace Buddy program. It's fairly new, but if you're new to the community, and new to implementing ArchivesSpace, I encourage you to join. Okay, so there's a link there. And don't forget, about the listserv. So if you're, an ArchivesSpace member, there's a member listserv. If you're not an ArchivesSpace member, there is, a Google group that you can join. That's very helpful. And ArchivesSpace also puts on webinars. Okay, so you can look at those. I've included a link in the slides as well. Okay, and then there's the ArchivesSpace Wiki. Okay, so don't forget about that. It has a ton of resources, including the ones that we've mentioned here. ArchivesSpace also has, a YouTube channel that you can watch videos. They post a lot, of the forums there. Sometimes they'll include, instructional videos. and registered service providers. Okay, so if you can't host locally, and you need some assistance, I check out the registered service provider list on the ArchivesSpace home website. All right, and thank you. And thank you so much to Anne Marie for her assistance with this. And Anne Marie, you can stop sharing. If there are, any questions, feel free to hold those until the end of the Navigating Your Implementation Lightning Round. I'm going to let the next presenter share their screen. Give me just a second.